Hello and welcome to Brian Moore's Full Contact with the Telegraph. Well, the 2021 Autumn Nation Series is now in the history books, and what a final round of matches we saw over the weekend. A clean sweep for the Northern Hemisphere sides, other Southern Hemisphere rivals, who will now return home after a long and at times challenging 12 weeks on tour. England gained revenge over World Cup champions South Africa with a 1-point win over the Springboks at Twickenham. Marcus Smith was one of many standout players on the field. The 22-year-old was flawless from the tee all day and showed his nerves of steel to slot the match-winning penalty with just a minute to spare. We'll be looking back at that win for England and where it ranks among Eddie Jones's finest with the Telegraph's Charlie Morgan, who was at Twickenham on Saturday and I think has been to Eddie Jones' press conference this morning as well. France, what about France? They laid down a serious marker on Saturday night, thrashing the All Blacks in Paris. The match had been billed as a shootout between two of the favourites for the 2023 World Cup, but as it turned out, the French were quite comfortable winners, and they looked well and truly back to their best. We'll be speaking to their former international fly half, Thomas Castaignède, about the ceiling. Well, is there a ceiling for this current side? There are also wins for Scotland and Ireland, and Wales will left it very late to see off 14-man Australia at the Millennium Stadium, and we'll assess the state of all three sides ahead of this year's Six Nations, which, frankly, should be one of the better ones, thank you. Elsewhere, England women made it 4 wins from 4, thrashing the USA on Sunday. The result caps off a perfect month for the Red Roses, who saw off all their nearest challenges with ease to firmly establish themselves as the world's best side. We'll assess their chances at next year's World Cup and ask what, if anything, can be done to stop them lifting the trophy. Delighted to say that we've got specialist help on the Red Roses front and on the wider rugby front, because my co-host today is the England World Cup winner, Rachael Burford. Hello, Rachael.
Hello, how are you?
I'm all right. Thrilling test match at Twickenham at times. Were you there?
Yes, I was fortunate to be there.
What do you make of it?
Do you know what? I think overall, it was a really exciting game. I think we got two different halves, didn't we? The first half where England were absolutely dominant in all areas, really had a real statement of intent about how they wanted to play. And they set that stall out really early. And I think that is what then propelled them on throughout that game, you know, going for the corner for the off the penalty, not just going for 3 points, asking for another scrum again. Like, their intent and their intentions were set right from the start, and it was just a fantastic test match. I think, you know, obviously South Africa came back in the second half, caused a lot of problems, and you kind of thought, oh, here we go, we know how this is going to end.
There was an air of inevitability, wasn't it? I was saying to the person next to me from Queen's, I was saying, it's just got this written all over it, hasn't it? You know, the Boks are going to win by kicking penalties again. England will outscore them to tries. And they'll say quite rightly, it doesn't matter how many tries you score, it's the points on the scoreboard. But frankly, I'm getting pretty sick of seeing sides just kick the ball in the air, sneak penalties and win. And it didn't happen like that because they managed to withstand some quite heavy onslaught of physical pressure, especially from the bench. Now, what did you expect that to happen? Because I didn't.
No, I think when you started to see that kind of rumble of South Africa in that second half, like you say, you thought, right, this is how it's gonna turn. But I just think there's different, when you've got so many young players playing against such a big side, world champions, we know what happened last time. When you've got new blood in there, there's a different psyche. There's almost like there's no preconceived of how this is going to go.
Yep.
And it's a little bit like that with England women as well. They've got young girls who played against Black Ferns. There's no preconceived. And I think we saw an element of that in the game. And I think that counted in that second half. Yeah,
that's interesting. I hadn't considered that as fully as I might. I was just more focusing on the fact that players like Bevan, Robb, Nick Dolly and so on, you know, they're 19, 20, 21, 22. And in the front row, you simply are not as powerful as you're going to be 10 years later. And it's very difficult, no matter how talented you are, to stave off a physical challenge from very experienced players. And I didn't expect that. And I also, I mean, people are saying, well, look, they're lucky. There were only 6 scrums during the game. Yeah, they were lucky. But that's a game. You know, well, you might as well say South Africa were lucky in the World Cup final. There were more scrums. I mean, it's a pointless thing to say. Eddie Jones, I don't know, we'll find out from Charlie what he's been saying, but where do you think this comes in his particular rank of results with England?
I think it's got to be up there, hasn't it? I think I think the biggest talking point for an England game has been that semi-final against New Zealand, and then we haven't seen a great display since then, or kind of like that magnitude. And I think, going up against the world champions, last fixture at home, lots of chat in the week about this inexperienced, as you mentioned, not necessarily dominant pack. They're going to be against the monstrous South African pack. There was all this talk about how this team wasn't going to be able to function. So when you feel like you got your back up against the wall, you're at home, it's your last game, I think this has to be up there with one of the best results for an England side. With all the new blood, the experience, losing so many key players, Jamie George, Farrell, Cowan Dickey, to not even be involved, I think it's a real big statement.
I think I put it in, I won't put it as one result, I put it as this series. I think this series has been very important for him to re-establish his credentials. Not that I ever thought he needed to. I was just making comments and criticisms, fully backing him to take us to the next World Cup, because that's what he's going to do anyway. And people were saying, he should go. We're barking, not even in any tree. So I'm just pleased for him that, having taken gambles, which he sometimes is reluctant to do for various reasons, they actually came off, which I think is an important thing. I tell you what, why don't we speak to Charlie Morgan, because he has got some tactical input on this, and also he's been speaking, I don't know if he's spoken to Eddie Jones, but he's certainly been listening to Eddie Jones this morning. Hello, Charlie.
Hi, Brian. I've got a couple of questions in.
All right, go good. All right. Don't want to get too carried away, because, England's new backline, it's only had a couple of outings. But what were your main observations about the way that because I've got some very very trenchant ideas about this, but I'd be interested to see what you think they've achieved relative to what they set out to achieve.
Well, I think we spoke last week, didn't we, about how it was the system that they used against Australia was sort of meant to get the most out of each player's kind of respective skill sets. I think that looked smoother this time. That would have been partly because of more cohesion, but partly I just think they just looked closer to the sum of their parts, didn't they? And there was more clarity because players were in more familiar positions for a longer time. And I think if you think about how they managed to do that, as well as redressing the balance when Manu Tuilagi went off eight minutes in, and rearrange that centre partnership and get Slade at 12, Marchant at 13, and then Max Malin's getting an extended run for the only time this autumn, I'd say that was really impressive. And what the kind of key message that Jones gave in the live part of this press conference today was that he was impressed by how he thought England actually won that game twice, and I totally agree with that. And I'd actually say that on top of that, that's been something that they haven't managed to do. Maybe he used the terms. It could have been easy for England to be flustered and frustrated by how that third quarter went. I agree with that again, and the fact that England managed to get out of that said a lot for how cohesive and calm actually they were.
Marcus Smith, he had another decent game at 10. I made the point that Courtney Law's leadership showed that whilst Farrell might well come back into the squad, or whatever, no one should fear any longer, aside starting without him. Because actually, I mean, I come back to this point. How different would England have been being able to build a side round Manu Tuilagi for 10 years? I mean, everything works when he's at 12, and he looks better, and it's all balanced. And then, you go there and he lasts 10 minutes.
Yeah, that's it. Well, that's been the problem for kind of a succession of England coaches, haven't they? Not being able to rely on Manu Tuilagi to stay fit, and actually for that reason, I think the way England readjusted was even more impressive. You're right, certainly to highlight the leadership of Courtney Lawes. Tom Curry took over the captaincy when Lawes went off. Again, looked really, really calm, and especially in that, you're certainly looking up at Eben Etzebeth at the end. In that exchange with referee Andrew Brace, but yeah, again exuded that calm that was a real feature of how, even though they were under the pump, they managed to get through.
And Smith said afterwards that they specifically were targeting this game for the last 4 weeks, as all the focus has been on there. What kind of traps did they set South Africa?
I think we're going to get on to kind of where this ranks in, as far as Eddie Jones' best wins, I think, later. But what you've seen from the big performances under Jones is that there's been a real precision at the beginning of those games where you can see that there's something that they've targeted in training and they've been working on. And I thought, well, from what Mark has said, they've been working towards playing the Springboks, and in particular, a few areas of the Springboks game, their strengths, for a few weeks. And I thought, at the beginning, England were flawless in the kicking exchanges. They got that 5-metre scrum through Ben Young's grubber after Marcus Smith had found space in the backfield. We'll talk about the scrums in a bit as well, but Richard Cockerell had mentioned in the week that they'd highlighted South Africa's aggressive engage to the refs. Sure enough, they get a free kick and then a penalty because of that exact offence. They went short from the line-out to mitigate Etzebeth and Diego, and then scored from that line-out. But my favourite kind of piece of the game, and the bit that really shone through to me that they'd been working on South Africa's blitz defence was Henry Slade's Rachael Burford-esque pass from first receiver
to Marchant.
Across to Stewart, missing out Marchant, straight across to Stewart, missing out that midfield slice that they played with. And they used an option they hadn't used all autumn. Now that says to me also that you can't take players at face value when they're saying they're just concentrating on the next game, because for sure there were bits in England's preparation throughout the autumn that was targeting how aggressive South Africa are in that 13 channel. And you saw the effect of that in Rafi Quirk's try, because Damien Dilienda stayed narrow on Slade. Marchant was perhaps not respected as much as a running option, and had that hole and was straight through it. It was just really interesting that it felt like England manipulated South Africa with a narrative that they painted themselves. It was fascinating to watch.
I wondered what happened to Am on that one. He seemed to be all over the place, didn't he? He was flailing at Marchant when he took that. And anyone who's seen Marchant play knows he's a decent centre. He may not be the quickest, but he is elusive and he is dexterous.
I think, like Charlie was saying, that you manipulate by playing different plays, and so many eyes are on Marcus Smith and staying tight and watching him as a threat that you often lose what's in the front line as well. So they've definitely teed that up. They've obviously played different options to make South Africa look in on that, and then picked a different one this week.
This is a generic question, Charlie. I mean, when I say to you, what's your main takeaway about the way that England's style has been altered, I also mean for you to try and address if you can, within that, the Farrell conundrum.
Yeah, well, it was in the embargo, so I can't possibly tell you what he said until
right.
10 p.m. But I said, is it now a case that it's 3-2 with Slade, Smith, and Farrell? Because Slade was actually playing the role that Farrell would have played, and you've got to think. I actually think Farrell would have been perfectly capable of throwing that first cut out to Stewart. I think he's a pretty good distributor. It was whether he could play the role that Slade played for the second, where he just edged around Elton Jantjies and sucked in Damien Dielendy as well before freeing Marchant. If I wrote a piece in the week that was kind of saying that Henry Slade, I think it was his 43rd cap at the weekend, and I would have thought that maybe it was only 2 or 3 performances where he'd been influential throughout the 80 minutes for England. He maybe drifted in and out of games a little bit, and that's maybe a bit unfair, and England's midfield hasn't exactly been this rock solid thing for him to kind of operate within. But I thought he looked really influential, and him and Smith. And what you've got to remember is that Henry Slade didn't go on the Lions tour, did he? He actually had those 2 games against USA and Canada, and he's now started with Smith for 5 tests in a row. So that relationship has been building, and it's whether that is now the creative kind of the creative hub, I guess, for England's midfield in a way that Farrell and Ford were previously.
Just a last one. I asked Rachel about where this ranks in the Eddie Jones list of wins. What do you think?
Well, I think with England, in a funny way, it reminded me a little bit of what he did with Japan and South Africa, in that he had the time to kind of concoct a game plan and carry it out. But I'd have New Zealand, as Rachel said, I'd have New Zealand at the top of the World Cup. Then I'd have any of the test wins against Australia in 2016. Yeah. Then I thought the win in Dublin at the beginning of 2019 was fantastic as well. I'd have this one just off that podium, but still absolutely the best since the World Cup.
What do you think about my comment? I said I think as an overall series of results this autumn has been important for him to get reward for doing what a lot of people said he should do, and to be honest, what he might have felt himself for making bolder changes and seeing them come off. Because the worst thing would have been for him to make changes and then having knocked back and think, right, I'm going to retrench further.
Yeah, well, I think that would have given him the opportunity, wouldn't it, to go back to the guys that he trusts and has tested before. But I thought before this series that actually 2 wins would have been fine if he'd have managed to unearth players down the spine. Now, he's managed to... Freddie Stewart looks like he's played 30 tests already. Marcus Smith looks like he's settled. Those are 2 positions down the spine that look like they're he's got those options now. To do that as well as winning, as you say, is priceless, because not only is he building experience, he's building confidence as well.
Charlie, we'll wait to see what the embargo says. Well, we'll wait to see what they say outside the embargo. Thanks very much for joining us.
Nice one.
Rachel, overall, I was quite prepared this time round to say the results don't matter, and I never say that. I hardly ever say that. What matters is we learn things and who can and can't play at this level, because this is about the last time, seriously, when you've got chance for proper experimentation. You're now starting to get into the World Cup spiral right down to the business end. So the fact that I don't have to do that is a big plus. How much do you think the imperative and the bonus of keeping winning is important relative to what you find out about players?
Well, I think I'm with you that, necessarily this might not necessarily been the need to win, but to find out lessons, to learn about players. But when you then put the 2 together, that breeds so much confidence moving forward. Yeah. So then it's almost like it's not a case of, we've found some new people, but now we've got to learn for those big mistakes that we had. We've got to try and get those right. So then that's a new bit of pressure, right? So then leading into the Six Nations, you know that you've been in tough situations as this group. We know that we've got new players and we've found a way to win. So I think having both go hand in hand, and that, look, we could probably pick a lot of areas that England weren't great at and they still need to grow more depth in and get better skilled at. But to come out of that series, which was building, you can't say that Australia, South Africa and Tonga weren't 3 physical tests for them and challenging tests. They were. But he carried on experimenting. He didn't just, like you say, bring in some familiar faces or start with the people that he can know and trust that can maybe pull something out. He really used it as a learning experience. And then to win on top of that, I think, that breeds so much confidence then for the side. And for, the new players coming in, the experience around that, to then have even more quicker belief and buy-in and trust to those players is it's an added bonus, really.
And I just add this, because people are forgetting this. In the background, England have got a brand new coaching setup as well. Underneath Eddie Jones, you've got a new attack coach, new forwards, defence coach and so on. So they're having to bed in, and for their confidence as well, seeing their efforts fulfilled and rewarded on the field in terms of what the players have been able to do, the effect it's had on the opposition, and the result, is a big fillip for them, because don't underestimate the need for them to get their jobs right as well. Well, France, what a marker they laid down on Saturday evening with a statement win, 40 points to 25 victors over New Zealand. Just how good were they? Well, we're going to ask someone who should know, the former French international Thomas Castaignède. How good can this side be, the French side?
Winning that game, is a massive success for the French team, but I think they can do much more than what they did, on that day. And I think but don't believe that this success comes from nowhere. If you think about where does it come from? We won the under-20 World Championship, in 2018 and 2019. We nearly won in England, and I think you remember 1 year ago, when we lost by 3 points and we came with, all the English journalists, said that we came with the second team and we nearly won against England, in 2020. Yeah. And I think the depth is there, in the French squad, and we got some very talented players. And now, with the coaches, with the staff, they managed to create the best of that team. And to be honest, that was probably the best game ever from a French team, against New Zealand this weekend.
Ntamack was experimented with at 12 this year, but he was very impressive back at number 10 at fly half. Who is going to get that fly half spot? Which of them do you think is the best option, or will they just mix them?
I was involved with Toulouse in the last 4 years, and I could see Dupont, and then Tamac every week, playing for the team. I think there's not one game where I've seen them playing badly. And, they have built their reputation, week after week. They just played, at the highest level, at every game. And in the last 3 years, Toulouse has won the championship twice with these guys. They won the European Cup. So you can believe that these guys, they got a massive experience. And definitely, of course, with Jalibert, we got a very good fly half. We've got other fly halves too who are quite good. But if you really want to win a World Cup, and Tamac is really key, into the French team. And but I think Jalibert can bring something special. And when he came on the field, he has brought some speed, some flair, But and Tamac is really the kind of 10 that you want in a French team, but in a very with an English style too. He can control the game, be very clinical, but then he can be very surprising what he has done, by taking this ball and doing like Blanco, in Twickenham a few years ago. Exactly the same. He's got the confidence to do that kind of things, and that's really amazing at his age. That he has managed, to deliver this kind of game.
The thing that stood out for me most was the fact that, a bit like England with South Africa, France raced away, and then they came under pressure, and the All Blacks were coming back. Now, in the past, the All Blacks have been able to overcome this, but France found another gear and went on again. So they did it twice.
Yeah, but Brian, and you know more than me, what it means to fight on the field, and I think we won that game with the forwards. I think we smashed them, at the start of the game. The physicality was there. Even with the backs, like the intensity of the defensive line was really amazing. And during 20 minutes in the second half, we just struggled because the All Blacks, came back into the game, and it was a time where we could have maybe, moved on the dark side of the French team, and we managed to come back, and it was really, really, not surprising when the mind of these players, because I think they know that. You can have some hard moments during a game, but I think you need to just cope with that. And when things are going a bit better, and that's what happened, with Tamac taking that ball, in his own 22, with Penaud, making this intersection from nowhere, because if he doesn't do that, then you can have a try on the other side. But that came from the forwards, and the forwards played incredibly well. They smashed New Zealand, and I think we could have seen that, in their look, they in their eyes, they were completely lost, on the game and during the game, and we won the game, by being physical.
And just on that, Sean Fitzpatrick told a few weeks ago that this French side should be considered as the World Cup favourites. Should they be?
Many things can happen before the World Cup, and you can see that we have some key players who could be injured, like Antoine Dupont. But I think what is good with this squad is we had four leaders missing in the team. Marchand was injured as the hooker, and he's the first choice. Olivon, the captain, was missing. Vakatawa was injured. Vincent, the other center, was injured too. I think we have many players who can play in the team, and I think French rugby is coming back, from very deep. But I think we come back strongly because we work really hard, to build young players and to develop them. And now I think it's a good time for us to have all the potential. But as you can see, one main thing is rugby that you need to consider too is referees, because a referee can change a game from one day to the other. It depends, how the rugs are really refereed, and a decision that could be made, when you see Australia versus Wales, things can be very quickly in rugby today.
Just a final point, Thomas. If the French are made favourites, and everyone thinks that, is it in the French psyche, the mindset, to say, OK, we're favourites, let's just get on with it? Or are they the sort of side like some sides who want to be underdogs, who don't want to be made favourites at any cost? Will they accept this and just say, That's the way we go?
I think what you need to consider is the mentality has changed completely in the French squad. We adapt. It took a long time, but I think now we adapt, to the professionalism, and we know what are the expectation of professionalism. One of the things that I've seen from Dupont when key thing, when he won the French championship, I was in changing room with him, and normally all these guys are really happy, exuberant, drinking, all that. But this guy only said, okay, I won 2 titles. And, he asked one of the guys, Jérôme Casalbo, who has won 6 for Toulouse. He said, now, as long as I didn't win 6 titles, I won't have finished the job. And it's exactly the same. I think these guys, they are on a mission. And it's exactly like England in 2003 when I've seen all these players, Kieran Bracken, from when I was playing at Saracens, and the Leicester guys, all these players who really wanted to write history. And I think they know they have the potential. And I'm pretty sure that the next Six Nations will be quite interesting because we receive England, we receive Ireland, and it will be very important games. But the road is still long, but we really have the potential to now think the opponents that we can win the World Cup.
Thomas, everything you say is very worrying from an English point of view. That's what I have to say. but
especially after the English game that I've seen this weekend, because to be honest, it wasn't really, even if you won, I wasn't really convinced.
Okay. Well, we will see. Mate, it's good to see you. Have a good Christmas. Have a good New Year.
Merci.
Well, first time the All Blacks had back-to-back defeats against European opposition since 1994. Look, Rachel, they were not at the best, but they were at the end. I keep coming back to this, and it's not inconsiderable. They've been away from home for 12 weeks. Now, that is a long old time. And also, you've got to remember, they've been in bubbles within their country, doing their performances domestically. So it's been a very atypical year, and I think you've got to consider that, but only partially. What do you make of the Southern Hemisphere sides as a whole throughout the autumns?
Yeah, I think you're right. It has been tough for them, and being in those bubbles, then that makes being away from home. Obviously, families normally travel as well, so I think all of that does have to come into consideration. But the teams are so well organised that they would have had preparation for this, understanding how to get through all of that.
Yeah.
And so I think, does fatigue come in? Do you start thinking about going home when you're coming into those final weeks? I think naturally it does. And then maybe that has reflected a bit on the performances in this last week for all of them. Yeah,
I think because people should understand, I don't think they'll be physically tired because they're very fit and they've got enough rest time when they're out, that will be built in. But when you feel mentally fatigued, it does affect you physically, and it's a very strange feeling, isn't it? You the will is there, or maybe you want to, and the body just doesn't respond. So let's build that in a little bit. But Thomas was talking about what will be a fascinating Six Nations this year. There's such a lot going up at stake. Where, as I say, we're going into the World Cup countdown. Ireland, Scotland, and Wales, they all wrapped up their autumn series with wins. Let's start about Ireland. Through the month unbeaten, a bit of a new style under Andy Farrell. What do you make of them at the moment?
I think they've been a bit up and down. I think we've seen glimpses of excellence, like the Japan game was great, and then everybody's eyes were on the New Zealand fixture. And I think the way that they played in that game was with real bravery and to really take them on. And I think that really kind of shows what Ireland can be. But again, it's that inconsistency for me. Yeah,
I think with Ireland, they are leading the way in this sense. I think they are starting to get in their forwards a balance between set piece and excellence around the field. The back row, Caelan Doris, who's been injured for a while. Conan especially is a big player for them. And whilst they've had good people like CJ Stander in the past who have been wrecking balls but have done certain things, but taking the ball into contact in different ways, you've now got players who are looking to offload, players who are looking to keep the game continuous. And if they continue with that, then I think they are going to get better. Well, I mean, Ireland's World Cup record is frankly disgraceful. I mean, it's poor. It really is poor. And they've never done themselves justice. They're in a group with South Africa and Scotland. So that's not going to be easy. I mean, well, let's take Scotland then. Some positives. Jim Hamilton was saying they just need to find a bit of physicality, but that's not as easy as just saying it, is it?
No, it's in the mind, but also in the body.
Yeah.
And you've got to be able to. It's easy to throw the cliche, we've got to be more physical than them, but you've got to get your body into that position, but your mind's got to be there first.
Yeah. Wales, very nearly only 1 win from 4, but they needed, and Rhys Priestland came up with it. It was a very strange end to that game. The only thing I say about Wales is they've been hampered a bit in their preparations by not having certain players, injuries to other players, and Wales have this, they're a bit like Australia. They seem to make the best of things coming up to a World Cup. Their World Cup record, whilst they've never won one, is much better than Ireland's. It's better than Scotland's. And they seem to be there or thereabouts. I think the building blocks are there. But this autumn series, I think, I would be more concerned if I were Wayne Pivac if they had a really bad Six Nations.
Yeah, I agree, because as you mentioned, they've had a whole host of injuries, which then have a huge amount of knock-on effects, because it's not just one or two.
Yep.
Wasn't it something like 19 of their players?
A lot of them, yes.
Yeah.
I didn't count, but yeah.
But and that really does take a big hammering, because that means less time with new players who are coming in. But again, to be able to win 2 of them, not necessarily in comfortable style, and potentially should have won better, having 14 men on both against Fiji and also against Australia at the weekend. Probably should have done a lot more. But they do find a way. It's almost like they know how to peak at the right time.
Yep.
And I think for Wayne Pivac and Wales, they'll be judging themselves after Six Nations.
I'll tell you another thing they have got to look at. And this is too much of a... People say, well, this is a conspiracy too far, but it's not. In every World Cup, they have had, towards the end of their run in the World Cup, really significant injuries to quite a few players. And you can say, well, that's just coincidence, but this is happening too often. It's happened all the time. And I think someone has to look at their preparation to see if there is something they're doing before the tournaments that is affecting them in there, because everyone knows what strain they will have. But this isn't happening to other teams. And at some point, they have to take on board that this is something that they really might consider, even though they don't believe in it. Let's turn to the women's campaign, which was extraordinary. They ended their autumn campaign with a huge and record win, 89-0 over the USA. Irrespective of any other factors, how impressed have you been with just them?
I think they have been excellent. I think the first 2 rounds against New Zealand, they were outstanding. We've had inexperienced players, we've had new caps. He's been able to have a look at different combinations, all against playing what are the next best, the second in the world, third in the world, and fifth in the world. So to be able to experiment and be able to deliver that consistent performance throughout has been really good to represent the depth that England have. Were there errors, and were there areas that actually, against a better side, they would have struggled against?
Oh, of course there were, yeah.
Yeah, there was plenty of that in there as well, which is quite worrying, considering they can put this amount of points on each of these teams, and they probably, in every single game, left 4 or 5 tries out there as well.
Let's give Simon Middleton a shout-out and his coaching team, Brett Deacon and others. I think their attention to detail was good. They clarified things. And Simon Middleton, a bit like Eddie Jones, made calls which could have been questionable. Holly Aitchison playing out of position to try and replace Emily Scarrett, moving Poppy Cleal to the second row from where she is very effective at 8, and the raft of changes he made later on, and those came off. And I think he deserves credit for that, because certainly he will get, and probably should get, stick if they don't go right. But he said the entire women's game has obviously been improved by handing out these professional contracts. He called on other nations to follow suit. But how far away are you, do you think, from really getting that with other nations?
I think there's one thing just saying you need to have a contract.
Yeah.
Because, yes, that's going to give you more time together, you can dedicate to it. But who are you playing? like the reason
What's the infrastructure around you?
The reason why the Red Roses are in the position they're in now, yes, they've got full-time contracts, but the Allianz Premier 15 is a highly competitive competition week in, week out. So you're playing at that level alongside being able to train full-time. That's for me, it's the infrastructure around building into having contracts for players, not just going, oh, here we go, hand out a load of contracts. Because, again, that infrastructure filtering down, you need to have the full circle, don't you? You need to have feeding into it. You need to have that domestic competition. And I think we have to underpin how important domestic competition is in the women's game.
You see, one of the ways of solving this would be to allow a wider competition with Welsh, Scottish and Irish women's teams. But then England have no responsibility to make a success of other countries' efforts. So whilst it would be one, for me, that would be a last resort, because, but come what may, this is the point I'm making, the generation that is coming through and seeing England do well, we have to capture that some way, and we can't wait for 5, 6, 7 years for other sides and other nations and other unions to finance their things, because all this goodwill will have gone.
Yeah.
Because come what may, people don't like. I mean, I thought it was great England winning, but I didn't want them to win by 89 points. Yeah,
of course. You want it to be tight, on the edge of your seat, jeopardy. You want to be able to have... That's what draws people in. That's what gets the excitement. And yeah, they play fantastic, great tries. That gets everybody excited as well. However, you want to have those nail-biters. And I think, England are developing the other nations. But they can't sit still and think, right, well, we'll put a hold on this, because we've got so many Irish, Scottish, Welsh, USA, Canadians, all playing in the Allianz Premier 15. So we are inadvertently supporting them already and have done for a number of years. But everybody's got to take a massive step up now. They've got to think about long term, how do we get this infrastructure in? What do we do? Because, I mean, frankly, in the next year, that is a huge task to be able to come in. I mean, how can you see anybody at the moment beating England at the Rugby World Cup?
Well, I think there are two markers. I think the next World Cup, if England do well, it will sustain the thing here. I think where the next Women's World Cup is placed, if the England bid is successful, because that's a very ambitious bid. It's a bid which will contain a huge amount of publicity for the women's game in the area, in the Europe where actually all the money is. And funnily enough, the men's game, which has struggled to come to terms with geopolitics in rugby terms, is now going to have to go through this with the women's rugby. Where are the areas where the money is? And you can't divorce it from that. And these things are going to be very difficult things. But I think just as a basic level, let's congratulate England for their professionalism, the way they've done this, the way they've said about it, the way they've interacted with the fans after the games. And it's been nearly an hour they've been outside. I mean, is that something that they're told to do or they do naturally? Because
I think they do it naturally. Yeah, I just think they recognise where they are right now. They recognise the fact that times before we didn't have sellout crowds, the times before we weren't live on BBC, and they want to maximise that, and they know that they've got a responsibility to do that. And I haven't necessarily noticed this over the years, because I don't think it really existed. But being at Six Ways at the weekend, everybody out the stand just went down pitch side. Yes. They want to see them. They want to talk to them. I mean, the girls are giving their socks away. I don't know who would want a smelly sock, but it's just those kind of moments live with young people forever. Yep. And that's what's capturing. And so they understand for 2025, moving the competition around, growing their audience, growing their fans is vitally important to the success moving forward.
Just a word about New Zealand, because they're still England's closest challengers. Losing 4 from 4, not on the record. No one would have said that beforehand. How serious a blow is that? Is it terminal or?
I don't think anybody saw it come in. I think even New Zealand not playing any fixtures or against any other international opposition, you'd still would have thought it would have been a tighter game. Yep. Now, I had full confidence England were going to win, and I thought France would have tested them before I've even seen New Zealand play. But would I have expected that many points to be scored against them? Absolutely not. And that's what you can't get your head around. I can completely get my head around New Zealand losing, but not by those significant markers. And it is a worry, for them because...
Well, we need them to be competitive in their own World Cup, don't we?
Yeah, hugely.
Absolutely have to be.
And I mean, at the moment, people would be saying that they're not getting to a final.
Yeah.
Like from on the outset right now.
Which would be not good for the tournament either down there, actually.
No, not at all.
Well, let's hope that... Well, it's very strange wanting New Zealand to do well, especially in their own backyard. But let's hope so. Why do we have some questions before we tip out? A question from Bob. How do you see the up-and-coming Six Nations panning out? He makes various comments. Let's just leave it at that. I tell you, I think it'd be one of the most intriguing for quite a long time because of the way that the autumns have gone. Well, look, France, Ireland, England have all had good campaigns. Scotland, an uneven campaign. Wales, a disappointing campaign for various reasons. Italy, well, they'll be where they are. How do you see it going?
I think I'm with you, to be honest. I think France probably look hot favourites.
Yeah. But as Thomas said, they've got Ireland and England at home. That's a big thing.
That's massive. Like playing in France is one of the most difficult, if not the most difficult place to play in.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would say France are probably going in at favourites. But having said that, England, I think they're just at their journey and they've got a big old chunk of time now with a few settled areas that could really kick on. So yeah, it's going to be one of the ones where it's not a full blown conclusion.
Yeah, which is always good, isn't it? One from Toby. Is the Northern Hemisphere now playing better rugby than the Southern Hemisphere? And what does this mean for future World Cups? Well, this is a perennial debate. All I'd say is before we start blowing our trumpet up here, just look at the scoreboard and see how many we haven't won. We've won one. We've been in lots of finals. So I think it's too much. I do think the gap, so it is, has closed in this sense. That I think the Northern Hemisphere sides now have the wherewithal to beat the Southern Hemisphere opponents, which hasn't always been the case. Whether they can do it when the Southern Hemisphere sides are rested and not on a 12-week tour is a different matter, but at least I don't have a problem with the raw material.
Yeah, look, I think we're starting to see a bit more running rugby.
Yeah.
And I think we're being a bit more creative with how we're moving the ball, and I think that's been a big difference. When you've looked over watching Super Rugby, high playing ball in play times higher, offloading, playing out the back a lot, moving from edge to edge. I think we're seeing a lot more of that now in our game.
We'll combine the last two questions because one's from Derek Scott saying a reasonable autumn series Scotland, but he's been frustrated that they seem to have got on the wrong side of the referee early, and then Greg was making a general question about what do you make of the standard of the refereeing this autumn. Well, look, it's as simple as this. Refereeing sometimes is good and sometimes is bad. And you have to identify how the referee is going and get on the right side of him. And if you don't, that's your fault. I'm sorry, it really is. And when you look at the number of penalties, when you look at the number of mistakes referees make relative to players, it's not many. And I can't think of any game that I would say has been conclusively decided by a referee if you look at him honestly. So it's like that. I'm almost of the opinion now, unless you get egregiously bad refereeing, and I don't think there has been that, then it's a factor where you just have to say, look, you have to deal with it.
Yeah, it's a challenge. I think from a player's perspective, whether it's a right decision or wrong decision or questionable one, as long as it's consistent, you can get on with it. That's the biggest thing from a playing point of view. But you're spot on. Referees communicate so much now. They're literally, this is what I want from you, this is what I need from you, and you've got to be able to adapt. Yeah. And I know that might change from week to week, and that's where some of the frustration comes in from a viewer and from a player.
Well, it's a different referee. Of course it's going to change.
Very true. But that's the thing, you've got to be able to adapt week in, week out, like you do about whoever you're playing against.
Absolutely,
You've got to adapt to what they do.
Yeah. Well, that's all we have time for this week on Brian Moore's Full Contact with the Telegraph. A huge thank you to my co-host Rachael Burford and to my guests Thomas Castaignède and Charles Morgan. If you've enjoyed this episode, you can check out all our previous episodes by subscribing or registering to the Full Contact podcast channel. A reminder, I'll be here back throughout December where our focus will shift back to domestic and European rugby. But from now on, it's goodbye, and thanks for being with us through the Autumn Nation series, because it's been a blast, hasn't it?